Just saying Louis doesn't understand social distancing, so he goes up like wanting to cuddle everything, and particularly any babies young.
Most people recognize Prince Louis as the lively and carefree youngest son of Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales, often stealing the spotlight with his natural charm during royal appearances. He's known for those playful moments that break through the usual formality and make everything feel more human. But lately, something about him has felt off, and people are starting to pick up on that shift in a serious way. Recent reports have pointed toward a troubling update, one that was quietly acknowledged by King Charles III and Prince William. This is not the kind of news that blends into the background, and it has left many royal watchers feeling uneasy and searching for answers about what might really be happening behind palace doors. The timing alone made everything feel more intense. Hours before anything official was even announced, there was already a strange atmosphere forming. It was not the usual calm silence of an early London morning. Instead, it felt heavier, almost uncomfortable, like something unseen was pressing down on everything at once. Inside Buckingham Palace, that feeling became even more noticeable. Staff who normally move with confidence and routine began slowing down, their movements more careful than usual. Doors that would typically open and close quietly were now handled with extra caution, as if even the smallest sound carried too much weight. It was as if the entire building had shifted into a quieter, more controlled state. Footsteps echoed differently as well. People paused at corners, hesitating for just a second longer than normal, as if unsure whether to continue or step back. Somewhere deeper inside the palace, a clock struck the hour, and instead of fading quickly, the sound lingered in the air, stretching the moment longer than expected. Outside, London was just beginning to wake. A thin layer of frost covered the streets, making everything look sharper and colder than usual. The sky had not fully settled, caught somewhere between gray and pale blue. Even the early light felt distant, as if it was present, but not offering much comfort. Reporters had already begun to gather despite the lack of official information. There had been no announcement, no schedule, and no confirmation. Still, something about the atmosphere made them feel that something important had changed overnight. It was not based on facts, but on instinct. They stood in small groups, speaking quietly, almost as if raising their voices would feel out of place. There was uncertainty, but also a shared understanding that whatever they were waiting for was serious. Inside the palace, King Charles sat near a window at a narrow desk, his hands folded neatly in front of him. His posture remained composed, but his expression showed deep thought. The papers in front of him were arranged perfectly, untouched since they had been placed there. He had already read them more than once, yet their meaning had not become any easier to absorb. Across from him stood Prince William, his posture straight but clearly tense. There was a visible heaviness in his expression, the kind that rest cannot easily fix. The silence between them was not formal or distant. It was deeply personal and carried a weight that did not need to be spoken aloud. King Charles has spent a lifetime preparing for responsibility and public pressure, but moments like this do not come with preparation. They cannot be managed through planning or carefully chosen words. They simply have to be faced for what they are. Prince William had clearly not slept. The tension in his face and the stiffness in his posture made that obvious without a single word being said. He had arrived before sunrise without warning, moving quickly through the palace without the usual formalities. No one stopped him, and no one needed to ask questions. When they were finally in the same room, there was no immediate conversation. The situation had already been explained earlier through private discussions with medical professionals. Those conversations had been careful in tone, but they had left very little room for uncertainty. Advisors had been present during those moments, standing quietly to the side, unsure whether they should speak or simply remain in the background. Eventually, they stepped away, leaving only two people in the room: a father and a son, but also a grandfather and a future king. At that moment, titles felt less important. What remained was understanding, shared quietly between them without the need for explanation. At exactly 6 minutes past 7 in the morning, a decision was made. It was not delayed or debated. It was accepted with clarity, even if it was difficult. The announcement would not be postponed. It would be released as soon as the wording could be carefully prepared. Every sentence needed to be precise, not only to communicate the truth, but also to protect what remained deeply personal. This was not about managing headlines or public opinion. It was about handling something sensitive with the respect it deserved. The communications office began working quietly. There were no dramatic instructions or visible urgency. Instead, everything moved in a controlled and focused way. Drafts were written, reviewed, and adjusted multiple times, with every word being carefully considered. At the same time, a subtle shift began spreading throughout the palace. It was not something obvious or announced, but it could be felt in small, quiet moments. A senior aide paused briefly in a corridor, closing her eyes as if collecting her thoughts before continuing. A security officer stepped away to take a call and did not return as quickly as expected. A household manager ended a routine meeting early without explanation, leaving others slightly confused. In places like this, change rarely arrives loudly. It reveals itself through behavior, through small differences that signal something is not quite as it should be. By the time the first message reached the press office, the mood had already begun extending beyond the palace walls. Outside, cameras were fully set, and reporters were ready, even though they still did not have the full picture. Within a private residence on the grounds, Catherine, Princess of Wales, remained completely out of public view. Her presence was only felt through the quiet coordination of staff and the careful control of access to certain areas. The entire household had shifted into a more protective state, placing privacy above all else. William had not seen her since before dawn, not because of distance, but because certain moments require space before anyone else can step in. Even close family members were being kept apart while everything was handled behind the scenes, ensuring that each step was taken with care. When the final version of the statement was brought to King Charles, he read it in silence. He did not make any changes. Instead, he held the paper for a moment longer than expected, as if fully acknowledging what it represented. And once that moment passed, everything that followed became inevitable. Then he gave a small, quiet nod. It didn't look dramatic on the surface, but that single gesture carried weight. It marked the moment everything shifted, the point where a private reality was about to become public knowledge. Soon, the world would be told that a serious matter involving Prince Louis had been confirmed. And once that happened, people would begin dissecting everything. Every word, every pause, every carefully chosen phrase would be analyzed, with many trying to read between the lines and find meaning not just in what was said, but in what was left unsaid. But inside that room, none of that outside noise mattered. The focus wasn't on headlines or public reaction. It was on Louis himself, the youngest in the family, now at the center of something that required complete privacy and extreme care. When the doors opened later that morning, it wasn't tradition or ceremony that filled the corridor. It was a quiet, heavy concern that moved through the building, felt in the way staff carried themselves as they prepared for what would soon become public. What made it even more intense is that these changes didn't begin that morning. Long before cameras arrived and statements were drafted, something had already been shifting behind the scenes. At first, it was subtle, almost easy to miss. A school pickup quietly reassigned, a daily schedule shortened without explanation, a few public appearances removed from calendars using neutral wording that didn't raise suspicion. Louis had always been known for his energy, constantly moving, full of life, unpredictable in the most charming way. Unlike his siblings, he wasn't as shaped by public expectations yet. He moved freely, naturally, without overthinking. That's exactly why the earliest changes stood out so clearly to those closest to him. He became quieter, not in a way that caused instant alarm, but different enough to linger in people's minds. By the time questions started forming, the pattern had already been there for a while. Catherine, Princess of Wales, was the first to truly feel that something wasn't right. What others brushed off as tiredness or routine changes, she sensed as something deeper. There were mornings when Louis stayed at the breakfast table longer than usual, no longer rushing around with that usual spark. Afternoons came where his energy dropped earlier than expected, like he had already used up everything too soon. Even his laughter, though still there, didn't last as long. It came naturally, but faded quicker than before. At first, Prince William tried to explain it away. He told himself it was normal, that children go through phases, that energy levels shift, and that growing up isn't always steady. But over time, that explanation stopped feeling enough. A quiet concern stayed with him, growing slowly, pushing him to pay closer attention. He started noticing the small differences, the gap between how Louis used to be and how he seemed now. And in that space between reassurance and worry, Certainty began to slip. Eventually, a private consultation was arranged. There was no announcement, no visible sign, nothing that would draw attention. A car left quietly through a side entrance before sunrise and returned just as quietly, before most of the household had even started their day. Afterward, everything was kept deliberately vague. References were general, almost too general. Routine checks, precautionary visits, everything framed as normal, even when no one had actually asked for reassurance. And that's the part that stood out. Because when reassurance is given without being requested, it often reveals the very concern it's trying to hide. As the weeks passed, the atmosphere inside the family shifted. It wasn't sudden, but it was noticeable. Prince George picked up on it earlier than expected. Children notice more than people think. He began asking quiet questions, watching his parents more closely, sensing something had changed even if no one said it out loud. Princess Charlotte also softened in her behavior, becoming more careful in a way that didn't quite match her age. The household adjusted quietly. Nothing was openly explained, but everything subtly shifted. This wasn't denial, it was protection. Sometimes putting things into words makes them feel more real, and not every family is ready for that immediately. Outside the palace, everything still appeared normal. Catherine stepped back from public appearances, but the explanations felt familiar enough that people didn't question them too much. William continued with his duties, maintaining composure, even as those closest to him could sense the pressure behind it. The institution kept moving, just like it always does. It knows how to maintain order, how to manage situations, how to keep everything steady on the surface. What it struggles with is showing vulnerability without it turning into public spectacle. The second medical consultation didn't happen in secrecy, but it was still handled quietly. There was no dramatic cover-up. It simply took place in a way that didn't attract attention. Specialists were brought in carefully through routes known only to senior staff. Each discussion lasted longer than the last, and afterward, people spoke with more caution than before. There was one word that lingered in everyone's mind, but no one said it out loud. Not because they didn't understand, but because the situation still felt too fragile to define clearly. Over time, the mood inside the residence shifted again. It moved from uncertainty to preparation. Rooms were adjusted, schedules became lighter. Security increased, but in a way that didn't draw outside attention. Everything focused on stability, on keeping things calm, controlled, and private. Because when a child becomes the center of every major decision, change doesn't happen loudly. It happens quietly, with everyone adjusting in silence. William canceled 2 planned events without explanation. That alone raised quiet questions internally. One advisor eventually stepped outside the usual boundaries and asked him directly if something was wrong. William paused before answering, and when he did speak, he didn't offer details. He simply said, "Not yet." That answer stopped further questions immediately, but it also left behind a feeling that something serious was still unfolding. By the third medical consultation, nothing felt routine anymore. The tone had changed completely. The doctor spoke more directly, choosing words carefully but clearly. Possible outcomes were explained in a way that balanced hope with reality, without leaning too far into either. William listened without interrupting. Catherine stayed beside him the entire time, present for every word, every explanation. What was said in that room remained there, shared only between them and centered entirely around Louis. And after that moment, things didn't go back to how they were before. The household kept functioning because that's what families do, and especially what institutions like this are expected to do. But underneath that structure, something had already changed, and everyone inside could feel it, even without it being spoken out loud. Even though everything on the surface still looked controlled and unchanged, something underneath had clearly shifted. To the public, the palace remained steady, traditional, almost untouched by disruption. But behind those closed doors, the smallest details were telling a completely different story. Catherine, Princess of Wales, was seen lingering longer than usual outside certain rooms, as if gathering herself before stepping inside. Prince William, on the other hand, would sometimes remain seated after meetings had already ended, even after everyone else had quietly left. Within the royal circle, the focus had shifted entirely toward the youngest member of the family, Prince Louis, and that reality was impossible to ignore. The meeting that followed was not held in any of the grand state rooms people often imagine. There were no portraits watching from the walls, no gold frames, no long ceremonial tables. Instead, it took place in a smaller, more private space, designed for conversations that were never meant to leave the room. The curtains were drawn, not out of secrecy, but to block out the cold winter light and create a controlled, undisturbed environment where everything could be faced directly. Inside that room, titles lost their meaning. This was not about rank or tradition, it was about people confronting something serious and unavoidable. King Charles III arrived first and was already seated when the others entered. His hands rested calmly in his lap, but his attention seemed distant, fixed on a quiet corner of the room as if he was already processing what was coming. Over the previous days, he had received updates piece by piece, each one delivered carefully with softened language like possible and under review. But this time, there would be no uncertainty left. Prince William entered alone. No advisors followed him in, and no one closed the door behind him. He did it himself, slowly and deliberately, as if holding on to the last bit of control he had in a situation that already felt overwhelming. Instead of sitting across from the doctors, he chose a seat close to them, almost as if proximity could somehow make the reality easier to face. His expression remained composed, but the tension was clear in every small movement. Catherine was not present in that room, not because she was excluded, but because she had already been prepared in advance. She understood that this meeting would bring clarity, and that clarity would change everything for the family moving forward. The lead physician began speaking in a calm, steady tone. There was no attempt to soften the moment with comforting phrases. He spoke directly, focusing on facts. The results had confirmed what had previously only been suspected. There was no longer any doubt. The condition was real, and it would continue to develop over time. For a brief moment, King Charles closed his eyes. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a visible breakdown, just a quiet pause to absorb the weight of what had been said. When he opened them again, the formality in his expression had faded, replaced by something far more personal and heavy. The doctor continued, explaining options in careful, measured language. Everything was framed in short-term steps rather than long-term certainty. Even though the tone remained professional, the message underneath was clear. Life from this point forward would not be about distant plans, but about managing each stage as it came. Prince William stayed silent at first. His hands rested firmly on his knees, steady but tense. His breathing slowed, controlled, as if he was trying to hold himself together while taking in every word. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't as a public figure, it was as a father. He asked how much time there might be. No one answered immediately. The silence that followed was not hesitation, but the weight of finding words for something that could never feel complete or certain. When the answer finally came, it wasn't exact. It was given in ranges, in possibilities, in cautious estimates. It removed any false sense of certainty, but still left space for time that couldn't be fully predicted. King Charles asked only one question after that. He didn't ask about outcomes or procedures. He asked if his grandson was in pain. The answer was careful. Not right now. Not in the way people typically imagine pain. But it was made clear that what lay ahead would not be easy, and discomfort could become part of the journey. That answer settled deeper than anything else. King Charles gave a slow nod, not just acknowledging what was said, but understanding everything behind it. The meeting didn't last much longer after that. There was nothing left to debate, nothing to formally decide at that moment. The remaining steps would come later, including how information would be shared and how privacy would be protected moving forward. By the time the announcement was being prepared, the atmosphere inside the palace had changed again. It was no longer the tense silence of waiting, but a steady stillness that comes after a decision has already been made. Every word of the statement was chosen with precision. Nothing was added without purpose, and nothing was left unclear. The goal was honesty without turning the situation into spectacle. King Charles and Prince William chose not to speak separately. Instead, they stood together in one unified message, not as figures of authority, but as family members facing something deeply difficult. The timing of the release was also carefully planned. It was set for late morning to reach audiences across different regions at the same time. The palace understood how quickly the message would spread, even if it couldn't fully predict the emotional impact it would carry. Inside a small communications office, the final version of the statement was read one last time. No changes were made. No objections were raised. Everyone present understood that once it was released, the words would no longer belong to them. They would become public, analyzed, discussed, and remembered. Catherine, Princess of Wales, chose not to read the final version beforehand. It was a deliberate decision. meant to shield her from the full emotional weight until it was unavoidable. Some truths are easier to face when they are not read in advance. Prince William, however, did read it. He stood alone by a window, going through each line carefully. When he finished, he didn't react outwardly. He simply folded the paper once and placed it down quietly, as if even that moment deserved respect. When the statement was finally released, it came without build-up. No hints, no leaks, no speculation. Just a clear message shared through official channels. It confirmed that King Charles and the Prince of Wales were speaking together. It acknowledged that Prince Louis had been dealing with a serious medical condition requiring ongoing care. It also explained that recent changes to the family's public schedule had been made because of this situation. And it ended with a request for privacy, delivered in a tone that was calm, firm, and respectful. The reaction was immediate, but not chaotic. News outlets shifted their coverage instantly. Anchors paused, visibly affected as they processed the information. Social media didn't explode in noise like usual. Instead, there was a rare kind of quiet as people absorbed what they had just read. The usual arguments and speculations slowed down, replaced by something more thoughtful, more restrained. Inside the palace, there was no focus on how widely the message had spread. There was no celebration of attention, only quiet observation as staff watched responses come in, screens glowing in silence. Some exchanged brief looks, not of strategy, but of shared understanding. King Charles and Prince William did not appear publicly that day. There were no photos, no speeches, no attempts to expand on the statement. The institution chose to let the words stand on their own, something it rarely does. Catherine remained out of sight. Her presence only felt through the careful movements of those around her. And for those who understood, it was clear that in moments like this, motherhood does not need an audience. The world would react in time. But inside those walls, only one thing truly mattered: family.